Hello and welcome to this video on public debt. So in the video we're going to look at the UK's current government budget position and then look at the case for and against austerity versus fiscal stimulus. This is a summary of the UK government's tax revenues on the left hand side, so money coming in, and spending on the right hand side, so money going out. And we can see that the money going out, the government spending, is greater than the government tax revenue, which leaves this deficit, this government deficit here of 84 billion. And how does the government spend more than it receives in tax? It has to borrow money. And so for the UK and many countries, this has led to high levels of public debt. When we focus on what the government spends money on, we can see that the biggest proportion is on, it's very faint down here, but social security protection, so things like pensions. Then we have health, and then we have education. A couple of other interesting ones to note is this one here. So 53 billion is paid on debt interest, paying back interest on debts the government have previously accumulated, which is more than the government spent in total on defence, on transport, or on the police and justice system. So these budget deficits that have been accumulating over a number of years, quite significantly during the recession 2010-2012, where tax revenues decreased and the amount of government spending required on things like unemployment benefits really increased, has led to quite a large national debt. When we look in the UK, national debt has grown to nearly 1.8 trillion pounds. When we look at this number and how it's developed over time from 1900, we can see that the level of public debt today in the UK, we could consider it to be very high. And the UK is not atypical here, it's not unusual in terms of Western economies. When we do go look back even further though in history, and we take it looking at it as a percentage of GDP, debt in the UK currently as a percentage of GDP is just around about 100%. When we go back and look at the period during the Second World War and even back in the 1800s, we can see the governments have had higher levels of debt compared to the size of the economy that is there to support that debt. So the UK government have had an objective recently to try and balance the books, to try and bring down the borrowing. So we have seen in the past the governments have been borrowing about 80 billion, and there's been a process here in which the government have tried to reduce that. Their forecasts are that they will still be borrowing through to 2020 and onwards, but they're trying to bring it down to closer to zero. And so this idea of the UK having very large government debt is not an unusual one. When we look around the world, we can see that in terms of public debts, governments are quite heavily indebted. This is the global debt clock that ticks up on the Economist website. We can also see here that for a lot of advanced economies, their levels of public debt are, as we said, around 100% of GDP. So what can the government do about this? Well, one argument has been that these debts are too high. We have to balance government spending and taxation. We have to control this increase in debt. And so how do we do that? Well, we try and reduce public expenditure, or we raise taxes. And so we've had this movement around many economies of austerity. And austerity here is the difficult economic conditions created by government measures to reduce public expenditure. So things like cutting back on teachers, cutting back on police officers, cutting back on healthcare. These sort of actions have been taken by many governments in order to try and control the debts that's been accumulating. And in many countries this has been unpopular, although many people think it's necessary. An alternative approach has been not to go for austerity, reducing government spending, cutting taxation, be concerned about these debts. is actually to say these debts don't matter very much if we can grow the size of the economy. And so actually we need to stimulate economic growth, particularly after the Great Recession of 2008. So for example, China has seen its total expenditure rise consistently as a percentage of GDP. President Obama's reaction to the 2008-10 global financial crisis was to introduce a big fiscal stimulus package. So increasing benefits, cutting taxes, spending on infrastructure. So this is really an alternative approach to try and stimulate the economy, to say that debt doesn't really matter. What more matters more is economic growth. And then the government debt compared to the size of the economy won't be as significant. So we've had a bit of an economic argument over the last 5 to 10 years about austerity versus fiscal stimulus. So let's have a look at some of the key arguments for both. Let's start off with austerity. First argument here is that having austerity improves the credit rating. As a borrower, I am assessed as how worthy I am or how credible I am at paying back my debt, and that's my credit rating. So if the government wants to face low interest rates, it has to have a good credit rating, and we'll have a good credit rating if the debts that it takes on are not too high. There is also another argument here that in the future this debt has to be paid back, and that will mean through increased taxes in the future. So if we don't want increased taxes in the future, we have to try and cut the public sector debt now. There is this argument we saw earlier about the 50 billion in the UK being spent on debt interest. What is the opportunity cost of this payment? If there was no national debt, we wouldn't have these significant debt interest payments, and that money could be used for something else. As the state grows, as we've seen earlier, we have this idea of crowding out. And so if we keep debts down, we keep government small through austerity, we can avoid this issue. Ultimately, it's future generations who will have to pay back the debt through higher taxes, and is this fair? Shouldn't this current generation be balancing the books? There is an argument that reducing the size of the state and the impact of fiscal policy enables monetary policy to be more effective. Cutting the size of the public sector may allow more efficient private sector businesses to provide these services. On the flip side, there is a case for a stimulus package. Firstly, government borrowing can benefit growth. Government borrowing to finance investment in infrastructure or capital spending, something that will help improve the productive capacity of the economy, will help grow the economy. As a result, the larger economy will then be able to pay tax to sustain these increased debts. Keynesian economic thought would suggest that there's an active role for governments to take in managing demand. Therefore, if we have had a period of stagnating economic growth, then a large boost to aggregate demand will be a way of stimulating economic growth. Actually, austerity is just exacerbating the recession or the stagnation that we've had, and is prolonging the slump. Interest rates around the world, when we look at monetary policy, are at record low levels. When interest rates are low, you should borrow, and that's no different for the government. The government should be able to get a greater return through investment than the cost of borrowing here. So this is the ideal time to do a fiscal stimulus package to borrow and spend. If the economy has a high fiscal multiplier, the multiplier effect is quite large for government spending, then it would make sense for the government to cut tax or to raise government spending here. One argument might be that targeted or temporary tax cuts would be a good idea to boost demand as well. So in this video, we've looked at the UK's fiscal position amongst other countries, and we've looked at the argument for and against austerity versus a fiscal stimulus package. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.